The Greataxes are a pretty good strength-based weapon class in this game. They get some very good damage and actually have some pretty decent speeds. Their movesets don't really cover that much variety, but they do get some nice weapon skill options, and also have a pretty decent power sensing moveset as well. Now these do perform very similar to things like Great Hammers, very similar range, damage, and moveset, but typically I just prefer to have the average Great Hammer over the average Great Axe. Even though they might do a little bit less damage, they just end up getting striking damage, which is better than standard damage. They also get more hyper armor and just get a lot more poise damage as well, which in my opinion, these things are just much better to have in PvE. But there are some really solid Great Axes in this game, as we'll cover on this list. There are 14 in total, and we are going to be ranking all of them from worst to best based on how useful they are in PvE. Starting off at the bottom, the Gargoyle's Black Axe. Now, I don't really understand the existence of like almost every single one of these Gargoyle black weapons. They just always get really bad range, really bad damage, terrible scalings, and get stuck with these non-unique skills, which doesn't make any sense to me, because when we actually fight the black gargoyles, they will get these unique types of destined death damaging skills. But when we get the weapon, we just get like the basic generic skill and like no reskinned version at the very least. Like this weapon gets stuck with Warcry, which is an okay skill to have, but obviously it can be put on many different types of weapons and it can just perform better with those instead. But yeah, at the very least, this thing just should have had a reskinned version of Warcry to just give it like a destined death effect on top of it. Number 13, the Gargoyle's Greataxe, which is kind of the same thing as the Gargoyle's Black Axe. It looks identical, has the same range, it also gets terrible damage, but this one can be infused. Does scale best off strength, and actually does get an S scaling in strength, but having really good scalings doesn't really mean much if you just have terrible base damage, which this one does have. And it's to the point where every other infusible Greataxe can just straight up outdamage this one with a strength infusion, and every other one too. Like this thing basically has nothing going for it. It has the worst range and the worst damage. Number 12, the Butchering Knife, which actually is the lone dexterity-based Great Axe in this game. And typically when you want to have these larger types of weapons, you're just best off two-handing them. And if you're two-handing, Strength is just going to be the much better infusion or stat to pair alongside these things, because it just boosts your damage by so much more. But the funny thing is, even with a Dexterity infusion, a lot of the other Great Axes can just straight up out-damage this one as well, because this thing gets pretty poor base damage and the scalings don't really make up for it. Now, it does have the lowest strength requirements, and it does tie for the lightest Great Axe as well. And it also has the benefit of giving you some HP for every single hit, which is roughly like 1% HP per hit. And there can be some pretty decent skills out there to pair alongside with this to really utilize some nice amounts of health regen. But even then, it's only going to end up being like a few % of health with every single one of these attacks, which isn't going to be the most groundbreaking thing, especially because things like Prayerful Strike is an Ashwar that can just give you 30% for every single hit. And also the Great Stars exists, which that weapon is just going to get more damage, more stance damage, give you passive bleed. Like the whole concept of that weapon just works way better than this one. Like this weapon should have had slashing damage instead of standard damage, and it should just hit a lot harder as well. Like almost every other infusible Great Axe can just do more damage than this one. Number 11, the Winged GREATHORN. Now, as a primary option, this thing just sucks. It gets stuck with a pretty poor strength and dexterity-based scaling. It can't be infused, cannot be buffed, the range is average, and basically every other Great Axe in this game can just straight up outdamage this, except for a couple of them. And the funny thing is, there also is like another quality-based Great Axe in the Axe of Godrick, and that one just gets more range and more damage, and an actual damaging-based skill. So that one's going to be the much better primary option, but this one still gets into the B tier purely because of its weapon skill, Soul Stifler. The skill actually creates this little bit of an AoE cloud effect that lasts about 10 seconds, and when enemies walk inside of this little AoE cloud, they end up getting debuffed to take 30% more damage for the next 60 seconds, which can just help you melt so many bosses in this game really quickly. And the fact that it's a debuff means that it's going to stack with all of your other buffs, and this thing can even stack with Frostbite as well. So basically, you just benefit of using this every single time. You just switch to this weapon, use the skill, and then switch back to your main option. Now, the thing is, it's not going to be that convenient. The animation is still a little bit long. The weapon is pretty heavy, so you're going to have to hard swap instead of just having it equipped in your back pocket. And the weapon does have higher requirements. You need at least 20 strength and 20 dexterity just to be able to use it, which a lot of builds, especially in regular new game, aren't going to have this much dexterity and strength. But if you do meet the requirements, I recommend just using it every single time. It might be a bit inconvenient switching back and forth, but you're going to benefit of a lot more damage. Number 10, the PUTRESCENCE Cleaver, which is one of the new Great Axes from the DLC. This thing actually does get some pretty bad range. The damage is not really that high, and the scalings can be a bit weird. Like this thing gets a strength and arcane-based scaling, which unfortunately there's no catalyst to accompany alongside this build type. And this weapon having an arcane scaling doesn't really mean anything, because this weapon does get a status effect, but it's Frostbite, and Frostbite doesn't scale of anything, which definitely is a shame because this thing is only getting like 50 or 60 frost buildup, and that's just not much at all. It's going to take a long time to be able to proc the status effect. Now, the way I'm talking about it, it might seem like it's trash, but thankfully its skill is actually somewhat useful. Spinning Guillotine actually does this nice little multi-hit attack that can stun lock enemies very nicely, and you get the option of doing like continuous inputs or doing like another quick triple swinging attack. Now, these attacks can do some nice stance damage, they can stun lock, they get some nice hyper armor. But the thing is, every single time that I use it and every single time I talk about this weapon, I'm just going to compare it to Wild Strikes because it kind of works somewhat similar. But the thing is, Wild Strikes can just do more damage, be a lot easier to use because it has much shorter animations, and you could pair this thing alongside a Cold Infused weapon and just get a lot more Frostbite build up too. Now, there are some of these attacks that can swing really quickly, and I think you get more potential in terms of poise damage. But I think the major reason why I don't really care it as much as Wild Strikes is going to be those longer animations. For some reason, after you use the skill the first time, you can like cancel it almost instantly, but after you use it the second time, you get stuck in such like a long recovery animation and you just almost get hit every single time. I did do like an entire playthrough only using the skill somewhat recently, and every single time that I was using it, I just wish I was using Wild Strikes instead, because that skill just performs way better than this one. Number 9, the Axe of Godrick, which is another strength and dexterity based great axe. It is sombra based, cannot be infused, and cannot be buffed, and the fact that it is a quality based weapon means you're not going to really have much synergy with spells, and also like the total overall damage is not going to be that high. Basically, every strength infused great axes is going to do more damage. But the Axe of Godrick does have a couple of things going for it. One, it does get a unique heavy attack with that nice horizontal swipe. She has the exact same one as the Crescent Moon Axe. It is a little bit slower, but it does do a bit more damage and actually covers a nice wide radius, which obviously is going to be really good for crowd control, but it's not that necessary because the weapon skill already does that. I command the kneel does slam the weapon into the ground and does do a little short range AoE that surrounds the player. Now, the animation might seem pretty long, but you can cancel it after every single attack, which is very nice. The skill can also stun lock smaller enemies, and if you get surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, it can just like cheese them all very quickly. And you also do get the option of like a big third swing, and this third attack can actually do like just as much damage or actually more damage than the first two parts combined. Now, my biggest problem with the skill is it's going to be the damage still. The damage is only really good once you hit with the entire combo. If you just hit with the first two parts, which for most cases in this game, you're only going to really get an opening long enough for that attack, especially due to how short the range is. I feel like these first two parts could be doing like almost twice as much more damage, and probably just have a bit more range as well. Like, it does serve as a pretty nice AoE option, but there are plenty of different skills in this game that you can equip onto these Greataxes that also offer you an AoE, and that can just do more damage and more stance damage than this can. So just like all of these B tier weapons, they're pretty decent, but they're just going to be outclassed by something else. Number 8, the BONNY Butchering Knife. Now, this one does look identical to the regular Butchering Knife, but this one cannot be infused nor buffed either. And thankfully, it actually does get more damage and scale primarily off strength, so it's just going to hit a lot harder than the regular Butchering Knife, while also retaining the exact same health benefits. Does give you that 1% HP for every single hit. Now, in terms of its skill, Honeblade, it is going to be a weapon buff that does boost your damage by 6% roughly, and also does double your healing effect. So while the buff is active, you're just going to get 2% HP per hit, and it's get a bit more damage. Now, I kind of wish this buff did do a little bit more damage, because the thing is, all of the other infusible great axes can still outdamage this one with a strength build with the buff, and having 2% HP per hit can be very nice, especially if you do have them power stanced. But if you actually wanted to go with a power stance great axe build, I would recommend having your offhand option give you something like Prayerful Strike, because Prayerful Strike can just give you 30% HP, and I think that that playstyle can just straight up outclass this one. But Honeblade does have some uses, and I think those uses are probably bugged as well. The major one being is that when you actually hit with this weapon while it's not buffed, and then use the buff, you do get a chunk of HP, and it is based on the number of hits that you landed beforehand. So say if you actually hit with the weapon 50 times, and then buff with the weapon afterwards, you're going to gain 50% of your health back. And you actually can stall this effect as well. You can just hit with the weapon a whole bunch, take the weapon off, and then unequip the weapon later on, and just use it as like a healing flask type of thing. And also, this thing does have some synergy with the deflecting too. Every single time that you deflect, you also gain a little bit of health back, which is pretty cool. So I think those two reasons are like the main reason why I have it this high on the list. But I kind of wish that the skill that it did have just went a bit harder. Like, instead of giving you just an extra 1% more heals per hit, it should be like 3 or 4% more heals. And the damage boost should be way higher than 6%. This thing should like at least be 15% more damage, because that's the exact same amount as Crackblade. So if I actually had those two things, I would consider this like a very solid A tier, but unfortunately I can't put it higher than B. Number 7, the Crescent Moon Axe. Now, this axe does get average range and average damage, and you also have to farm for it as well. And a lot of these axes can be acquired very early on, and some of them are easy to acquire. So you might be questioning why you would even use this thing, and the only reason is because of its heavy attack. It does get that horizontal heavy attack, which is the same as the Axe of Godrick and the Death Knight Longhaft axe. And this heavy attack does get a bit more motion rallies than like a regular heavy, and it also is going to have a nice horizontal spread, so hitting multiple enemies can be very handy. And the attack does come out a bit faster, so you actually will hit enemies sooner compared to like a regular charged heavy attack. But the thing is, the entire animation itself is just longer. So you do have just more of a chance of getting hit by this thing. But since the DLC releasing, the Greataxes have actually received a big damage buff with their charged heavy attacks, and their uncharged heavy attacks are faster now as well. So just having the heavy attack as like some nice crowd control utility, it can be pretty decent. Now for me, I don't think it's that useful to the point where I'd sacrifice it over like the amount of damage that you can get or other type of unique benefits with the other different types of infusible axes. And Greataxes also get access to like diagonal swipes anyway, which can be almost just as good in most cases. So I'm not going to really value this one that much. Number 6, the regular Greataxe. Now this one is quite literally the highest damaging infusible Greataxe in the entire game. Like basically with every single infusion, this one can straight up out damage the rest. Now it actually does have the drawback of having some of the worst range and also having some of the highest requirements too. But obviously if you just want the hardest hitting infusible Greataxe, this might be the best option. Now the reason why it's still only going to get into the B tier is because there are other infusible axes in this game that do almost just as much damage, but just have another benefit to them that will just make me want to use those instead. Like the Rusted Anchor gets piercing damage and not that much less AR, but the fact that piercing damage is so good, it kind of just means that that one just directly outclasses it in terms of damage. The Executioner's Greataxe just only gets a little bit less damage as well, but that one just hits much further and it gets 115 crit. So if you actually end up getting stance breaks, this one is just going to outdamage it too. And things like the Great Omenkiller Cleaver get bleed, which I'm also just going to much prefer over just a regular generic Greataxe. So yes, this thing can get the most damage, you can get it very early on, but the thing is it just doesn't get that much more damage to make me want to use it over the other different types of Greataxes that have these different benefits. Number 5, the Longhaft axe, another infusible Greataxe that does scale primarily off strength, and this thing actually can have some of the most range and the most damage, and actually performs well with almost every single infusion. It's just like consistently top 3, and this thing can actually even outdamage the Executioner's Greataxe with some elemental builds, and with a quality build, like at max level, this thing can just outdamage it. And honestly, if you are going to go with an elemental build, I'd probably just go with this weapon, because it actually does have some of the lowest requirements in strength at only 24. Now the main reason why it is going to get this high is because it actually does get boosted hype armor when two-handed over the other different types of Greataxes. So you can just like tank attacks a lot better with this one than you would with the other weapons, which obviously is very handy with these slower types of weapons. Now the thing is, this hype armor just kind of puts it in line with the Great Hammers, and as I mentioned, I'm still going to prefer Great Hammers a bit more because they just get a bunch more stance damage and also get striking damage, and the Longhaft axe can just get more damage than all of them. So if you don't really care much for stance damage, this one could just be one of the better options in the game, but even then that little bit of boost to hype armor doesn't really make me want to use it over some of the other infusible Greataxes, as we will get into. Like at number 4, the Great OMENKILLER Cleaver. Now this weapon does get some very mediocre damage with a strength type of build compared to all of the other infusible Greataxes, but it's the only one that does get bleed, therefore it's going to have a very good use. Because obviously bleed is like the best status effect in this game, it just like melts and destroys so many different types of bosses, and by having a passive bleed weapon, you can either go into an occult infusion, or just go into heavy infusion with Blood Flame Blade, and you can proc bleed very quickly, especially alongside some different types of weapon skills. Things like Wild Strikes or Stormcaller can just make for very broken pairings, and paired alongside the bleed types of buffs, it's just going to outdamage all the other Greataxes. Now the main reason why it's not going to get into the S tier is because I think the Great Stars just does a better job at doing this. Both weapons basically get the exact same moveset, very similar speeds, similar range, similar weight, but the Great Stars is a great hammer, so therefore striking damage, more stance damage, and it also gives you health regen for every single hit. So I think a combination of all those things just makes the Great Stars the better option. But the Great Omenkiller Cleaver does get some more damage, and it can also be paired alongside different types of skills like Spinning Slash or Sword Dance. So even though I do consider it a little outclassed, it definitely has enough uses for this thing to be a very high A tier. Number 3, the Executioner's Greataxe, which is the longest Greataxe in the entire game, and it also does get some of the most damage. In fact, with a strength build, it basically gets just as much damage as the regular Greataxe, kind of tied for the most. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to really perform as well with every other different type of infusion. So if I actually wanted to pair this with like an elemental build, whether it be Faith or Magic, it's not going to really do as well as the others. And also does get like the highest strength requirements too, while weighing the heaviest. So there is a lot of stat investment with this weapon. But the benefit is the most range, the most damage, and 115 crit. this thing can be like the highest damaging critical weapon in the entire game. So basically any single time that you go to get a backstab or get a stance break and go for the riposte, there is like no other weapon that you would rather have on than the Executioner's Greataxe. Now as I've mentioned, Greataxes aren't really the best at stance breaking, but since the DLC releasing, we now have the deflecting hard tier, and this crystal tier with his guard counter types of builds can just stance break so quickly no matter what type of weapon that you are using. Now the thing is, if you actually wanted to go with a guard countering Greataxe, the Rusted Anchor Steel just might be the better option because of the counter attack hits, but there might be some situations where this one actually can perform better. Number 2, the Death Knight Longhaft Axe, which is like one of the most fun weapons to come out of this DLC, and thankfully it's actually really powerful as well. It is a strength faith type of weapon that does get some split lightning damage, which is actually very unique. This is like one of only 3 different faith weapons that actually get some split lightning damage, and this one is actually the best amongst them. So for that reason alone, it just automatically makes this very useful. But the weapon actually does get some very good damage, some nice range. It does also get the Crescent Moonaxe heavy attack with that nice horizontal swipe. Does get a bit more damage than the regular heavy attacks, but it is a little bit slower. But it definitely adds some great versatility to the weapon. But the best part about it is going to be its skill, Blink Bolt Longhaft Axe. As I did mention in the regular axe video with the Death Knight Twin Axes, it does actually perform as a nice A-frame dodge. Does get a little bit of some starting up frames. So if you actually wanted to dodge an attack, you have to preemptively use it. You can't really like react to it like a regular dodge roll, but it does give you lots of frames. It closes in the gap really quickly, and you get the option of a very hard hitting follow-up attack that gets very good hyper armor, also gets some very good tracking, and the damage is just ridiculous, and it does like over 30 stance damage as well. It's just so cool being able to like dodge attacks and close in the gap really quickly and safely, and just having the option of a hard hitting attack. Like this thing can straight up cheese so many different types of enemies. Now even with all these positives, it's not going to be without any downside. One, the Blink Bolt skill might require a little bit of skill to use, take some getting used to. Reason number 2, the AoE itself is not that large. Sometimes you might just like overshoot your target and you want to be able to hit them with the AoE and it doesn't really go that far. And the Aftershock AoE for some reason scales off dexterity and not faith. Like the initial slamming attack does scale off AR, so going into both strength or faith is going to boost the damage, but for some reason the actual like Aftershock wave is just not pulling from the faith stat and it's just going off dexterity, and this thing gets an E scaling in dexterity, so the damage is not going to get that high. And it's kind of weird because when you go level up the faith stats with this weapon, it boosts the lightning damage, but doesn't boost the lightning damage of the skill. So I kind of wish it did get changed to where that Aftershock lightning effect does scale off the faith stat. But those are like the only few things that I dislike about the weapon. But other than that, you have like a really powerful and really fun option. And at number 1, the Rusted Anchor. I'm sure to nobody's surprise, this thing is not only the best Greataxe in the game, but it can be one of the best strength weapons, period. And it's just so good to pair alongside many different types of builds. Now, the AR of this weapon isn't going to be the highest compared to some of the other Greataxes, but the thing is, it just can outdamage the rest because this thing gets piercing damage. And as I always mention, piercing damage is the best damage type because a lot of enemies are weaker to it. And when enemies are in the middle of an attack combo, they just take bonus damage to this specific type. And when paired alongside the Spear Talisman, you're just doing so much more damage. And it's to the point that the Rusted Anchor can be the hardest hitting strength weapon in the entire game. So if you actually end up building around this thing to be able to trade out with hits, whether it be with things like Wild Strikes or a guard counter build, this thing can just be utterly broken. And Greataxes just consistently get better with every single update. They just keep buffing the speeds and the damage of these movesets, and it just makes the Rusted Anchor just even better. And another amazing thing about the weapon is that you get it very early on in the game. You just have to pay a trip to the Weapon Peninsula, kill a very easy boss, you don't even have to spec into much strength, and then you now have access to one of the most broken strength weapons in the game. Okay, that is all 14 Greataxes ranked. The next video is going to be touching on the hammers, and then we'll move on to the great hammers and such. So please do definitely like and subscribe for that one. Also, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. If you do feel that I've missed something or if you disagree, definitely do discuss it down there. And also do follow me on Twitch because I'm live there every day doing a bunch of random ass challenge runs. So definitely come by and say hey if you haven't already. And I'll catch you guys around. Bye.